Iran says it's drafting a framework for future talks with Washington on its nuclear program. That follows indirect talks with the US in Geneva. But while Iranian officials were talking, Iran's Revolutionary Guard was doing this in a key global trade route. Military drills, announcing on Tuesday the temporary closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this came after the start of live fire exercises, which began a day earlier. Analysts say it's a clear demonstration of strength from Tehran amid a growing US military buildup in the Middle East and threats from the US President Donald Trump of consequences if Tehran fails to do a deal. But why is this waterway such a potential flashpoint? Well, the Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important shipping arteries, connecting the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. From there, ships can then travel to the rest of the world. It's around 33 kilometres wide at its narrowest point, with 20% of the world's oil passing through it every day. And threats to disrupt the flow of trade there have previously caused spikes in energy prices, including during the Israel-Iran war in June. All right, let's take a look at this with Middle East expert René Wildangel. Welcome back to DW, René. Talk us through how damaging this could be. On a scale of 1 to 10, how damaging would an Iranian blockade of the Strait of Hormuz be?
Well, we know that this is a vital route for the world economy, and it would clearly harm the interests of the US as well. The potential for escalation still is huge if these negotiations fail. But on the other hand, I think we have to ask the question, is there an interest on the Iranian side to escalate? And I don't think so. And I think this is why we have seen the Iranian foreign minister walk out of these talks relatively positively and with the message of the negotiations are going in the right direction. I'm not so sure if we will see an outcome here, but I think the Iranian interest to escalate here isn't there.
OK, we're going to get to that. I'd like us to, first of all, though, to focus on the threat and the potential damage. So talk us through the potential financial, economic and geopolitical ripples the closure of the Strait of Hormuz might cause.
Well, we know that this is approximately 1/5 of the world economy that depends on this route. So obviously, this could have grave consequences to the economy, to the financial markets, and it would be a disruption that would hit the world economy, the US, its allies in the Gulf. So I think it's not something that especially the US president wants to see. But on the other hand, I think it is something in the case of an attack that is also something that can be mitigated. And we have seen other great threats to the economy in the past years that have been managed. So I think, yes, the potential fallout is big, but it's not something that will, I think, prevent the US president from taking this decision.
And when Iran announces, as it has, that it's closing the strait for military drills, is it exercising a sovereign or legal right, or is this purely a military flex?
Well, it is clearly a threat. But we have seen this threat before, if we think about the conflict that we've seen in the summer. And Iran ultimately was attacked. We had seen negotiations that failed. We have seen an Israeli attack that eventually the US joined. And we had seen the same threats before. Closure of the Strait of Hormuz, massive retaliation to US bases in the region. And yes, we've seen retaliation to one base in Qatar, but it was a very measured reaction. And I think Iran also now knows if they retaliate, if they take such a step, they will be drawn into a major conflict with the US. And I think the overriding principle for this Iranian government currently, after the horrific scenes we've seen in January when they killed thousands of protesters, and so much frustration and anger in the population in Iran, is really regime survival. this regime has been called a zombie regime with the back to the wall. And I think what they want is to survive this crisis. And I think they're more looking into the prospects of a deal, as President Trump calls it, than taking such escalatory steps that threaten the persistence of this regime.
And this is what you were talking about when you said a little earlier. It's not in their interest to do this because the consequences for the regime would be dire.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is maybe the last chance for this Iranian regime to survive. I think they have lost most of the legitimacy within their own population throughout the world. And I think it is a matter of time until we would see more and renewed protests. It was extreme brutality that clamped down these protests. And I think the Iranian regime really is doing everything right now to survive. And a nuclear deal, and the Iranian government exclusively wants to talk about the nuclear enrichment. Such a deal with the United States might pave the way for such a regime survival, at least in the near future. Of course, this is also not an outcome that Iranians want to see. They want to see change, and such a stabilizing agreement that disregards the attack on human rights, the killing of thousands, and that is something that also President Trump, after these protests, had said that he wants to highlight these human rights abuses. A deal that would exclusively now talk about the nuclear enrichment would disregard this.
Where does Russia fit into this picture? Russia is holding naval drills with Iran in the region from tomorrow. So is it likely to take a side if escalation does happen?
I don't think so. I think this is a geopolitical muscle flex that we have seen here. But again, remember the war that we saw in June. We had seen a lot of threats by Iran. We also had heard about threats from the regional allies. But these allies are weakened. When we talk about Hezbollah, obviously when we talk about Hamas, all those allies have been weakened by constant attacks by Israel. And in fact, nobody came to Iran's help in this June attacks. And I think, yes, the Russians have geopolitical interests here. They're flexing their muscles. But in the case of an attack, I'm very sure that they will stay out of this.
So this is the background to these talks that are going on in Geneva. And as you say, the Iranians are trying to talk about them in quite a positive light. If they fail, how quickly do you see this diplomatic breakdown becoming military?
Well, honestly, that's very, very difficult to predict. But again, we have the precedent because we had negotiations that started in April, between direct negotiations as well, and Witkoff was involved as he is now, and we had seen a letter from President Trump to the Iranian leader Khamenei, and the goal was also a nuclear agreement. And when those talks failed, or in fact before even they failed in June, we had seen this wide-scale attack first by Israel, and then the US joined. So I think right now the Iranian leadership is trying to win time. We will have to see how long the patience on the American side lasts, but I think we could very quickly see a military confrontation. Again, I don't know what that would mean, because targeted military strikes by the US would not necessarily mean that there is a change in Iran and the fall of the regime. Quite the contrary.
And there's a bit in between, isn't there? And I wonder if you could talk to us about that. Talks are held. Ultimately, they do not reach a conclusion, but there's no increase in aggression from Iran. The talks just fail. How does America then escalate this gunboat diplomacy? How does it go? How does Trump execute his threat? No deal, therefore missiles start flying from our flotilla off Iran's coast. Does he need a tangible, credible excuse? Or can he just say, yeah, this didn't work, let's try this?
Well, unfortunately, I think this is the lesson that we have to draw when we look at Trump's and this administration's behavior from Venezuela to other conflicts, to the Ukraine negotiations. These are not classical negotiations that we know with negotiators, with diplomacy, with all the knowledge. This is basically Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner leading the negotiations without even a clear outcome. We have heard this is not only about the nuclear agreement, this is also about the missile program, this is about the regional allies, but we also heard President Trump openly talking about regime change. So unfortunately, at this point, I cannot look into the head of Mr. Trump. But if we look at the past months, I think anything is possible. And this can move to a military attack in a very short point in time. And it's very hard to predict at this moment.
Thank you so much for talking us through that so clearly, René. Middle East expert René Wildangel.
Thank you.